Hello and welcome to the Writing for Academic Publication webinar series hosted by the Graduate Writing Center at Teachers College, Columbia University. If this is your first time joining us, welcome and thank you for following along. If you've already engaged with another webinar earlier, welcome back. My name is Catherine Cheng-Stahl and I will be guiding you through this webinar. So this particular video is focused on preparing the manuscript or manuscripts, assuming that there will be many drafts involved in this process. My hope with this video is not so much providing a how-to guide for writing up the manuscript, rather giving you a peek behind the scenes of kind of what happens in this process. Of course, this is a very personal process and it might look different if you are authoring a manuscript by yourself versus with a colleague or a professor. So this will look very different depending on your manner of writing, but I nonetheless thought it would be helpful to see what this process might look like from beginning through the end. So this is a sort of timeline that you have probably seen if you watched one of the earlier webinars. These are the various writing phases as put together by Dr. Felicia Menza in her book. And so I will be in this particular webinar talking through, I would say, the first two that you see here. So let's begin with the early writing phase. I like to start with a quote from Dr. Felicia Menza, who says, "For words to fall onto the page, first you must make writing a priority. I do this by scheduling writing time and not allowing anything to take its place. It is my appointment with myself and my work." So I think what I wanted to really hone in on here is this idea of the importance of securing time, securing space, and protecting your energy to write. And all of this is part of the early writing phase, which is creating the right atmosphere for your ideas to unfold on the page. So in this particular video, I'm going to be walking you through the process of putting together a manuscript for one of my publications, which was co-authored by a professor of mine. So in this early writing phase, of course, it was assuming that you've already done a project. My co-author and I actually pursued an empirical study. We designed the research and pursued it within the early 3 months. And so after carrying out the collection and data analysis, that's when we started doing the writing as well. So that's the first point right there. So after we sort of had our data collected, we very soon began coming up with a writing plan, and we made sure to do this together because we were co-authoring this piece. So if you're interested in learning more about navigating co-authorship and writing in a collaborative manner, there is a separate webinar on that. So as part of putting together a writing plan, here are some things to consider that are part of the early writing phase. You might want to consider your writing style and if you have a particular process that you would like to honor. Of course, if you are thinking about this alone, then there's less of a discussion and more of just reflecting on your own mode of doing this. We also talked about putting a timeline based on our time availability. This is also something that's important to make transparent so that you lay out your expectations and have a plan to meet them. As part of writing, it's important to also arrange for a mode of communication or modes of communication that would work. There are different styles of writing together, different approaches, and whatever approach you pursue, it's important to figure out how you will stay in touch through the process. Will you be calling each other? Will you be writing together side by side in the same space? Are you going to be passing on drafts back and forth? Are you going to be reachable by text? Do you write emails? How often? All of these things are important considerations. And of course, if you are pursuing a writing project on your own. It's also helpful to map out a timeline for yourself and creating perhaps SMART goals for each of the action steps. Something else that we considered, because we were working on this writing project collaboratively, was organization of our ideas, storage of our drafts, and how we were going to share our writing. We decided on using kind of Google Docs for this. We also had a Google Drive folder going where we had screenshots of some of the figures that we were playing around with. So the idea is to have an open discussion around the entire process of writing, which involves more than just putting words on the page. There's a whole behind the scenes process involved in that, which I'm laying out right here. And finally, I think it's important to consider your individual strengths and skills when it comes to the writing. So for example, are you someone who has a really hard time maybe putting together that initial draft, but you are skilled in revising and editing? Maybe you have a special skill set in using citational management software, and you can very easily put together references and do all the citational stuff. Perhaps one of your strengths is organizing, outlining, finding kind of themes and sub-themes. So I think it's important to also have an honest conversation around what are you good at and how can your partner or partners complement your skills. I think another important aspect to think about in this writing process is to have an open conversation around authorship. This is something that, when delayed, can be a source of tension and awkwardness. And so in general, the earlier you have this conversation, the easier or the less painful of a process you're going to have. So what I'm showing you here is just a screenshot of the many drafts involved in manuscript preparation for this particular writing project. You can see that I started with the findings section sometime in March and continue working on the findings sections through May, and finally started writing the other sections late May into June before submission. So the idea is that this process is iterative, it is continuous, there's constant revisions, and I just hope that this peek behind the scenes gives you a sense of how involved this process is. So searching for possible homes, this is the main topic for another video. And if you're interested in thinking about strategies of finding a home, I recommend that you check out that video. So I follow that process. I actually used a combination of looking for journals more systematically, also anecdotally. Because I was co-authoring, I made sure to ask my collaborator about her experience with particular journals. So an important part of sort of preparing your manuscript is to tailor your writing and the organization and the style, all of that, to your target journal. So of course that requires that you know where you want to submit. And that is a process that doesn't just happen naturally. It requires an investigation on its own. So this particular slide here just shows you how my co-author and I created a Google Doc, and I took probably a week or so of time to do my research on journals, and I put them together in a Google Doc. So as part of this process of searching for possible homes, I just wanted to sort of walk you through what happened and then give you a glimpse of that Google Doc and what it entailed. So in compiling a list of possible target journals, I sort of, as I mentioned earlier, use a variety of strategies. And once I created that list, which had probably 10 to 15 journals, I went into each of the journal sites to read the author guides or guidelines for that particular journal. Within the guides, I was able to find information about the scope, the audience, the vision, the values of the journal. I looked up the editorial team and did a little bit of reading of who the people are and their areas of expertise, the types of research they do, their methodological approaches, et cetera, just to have a sense of whether their research ethos sort of matched with mine and my co-authors. I also spent some time skimming through recent publications of my target journals just to have a sense of the writing style, the length of a piece, the organization of a piece, to see whether it would be doable for our own project. Of course, I also took a preview of some of the logistical information. So is there a word count? Absolutely. What is that word count? Some journals give you more generous space. Others are very strict and give you a relatively small number. And so that's something to keep in mind for your project, because it's going to shape sort of what you prioritize or how much data you're able to really analyze and communicate in your publication. Figure allowance, citational style, is it APA, is it Chicago Manual? The timeline in terms of like how long it takes for you to get feedback, fees involved, all of these are things that I considered, and I sort of detail all of this information in that Google Doc so that I could better evaluate whether a journal was going to work for us. I also looked at journal metrics to get a sense of the likelihood of being accepted. So this is where, you know, the best journal in your field, however that is measured, might not be the best fit for your work at a particular time. So likelihood of acceptance was also be considered, because you don't want to put in all this effort and know that there's a small chance you're going to get published, because that effort might feel like it could be better put into another avenue. So after doing this process and sort of assessing the information, I was able to narrow down the number of journals to a list of 3 to 4, and then eventually we chose one to submit to. So at this point, I'm just going to give you a sense of what that Google Doc looked like, and then also walk you through a journal site and how to navigate it. So this is what the Google Doc looked like. You can see I just dumped a bunch of information. Sometimes I copy and pasted. Other times I synthesize information and then also added my notes in purple. I linked sample articles to look into. I took screenshots of journal metrics. And so this ended up being 16 pages of journal research before deciding on my top 3 or so. Here, I'm just showing you the webpage of the journal called Equity and Excellence in Education. And so you can see that on just about every journal page, there's a section called About This Journal. It might be called something different, but in general, there's this drop-down menu where you can look into journal metrics, the aims and scopes, journal information, editorial board, etc. I usually like going right into the aims and scope first, because that's a great way to figure out sort of the direction and editorial vision of the journal. It often will give information about the types of writing products that they produce, more methodological or conceptual, whether there's an area they hope to sort of build out more. They will often give you information around the frameworks that they are welcoming, as well as how open they are to more innovative or creative modes of communication. So this is the page where I like to spend more time, and I'll often copy paste and sort of do some highlighting to find those keywords and think about how does this align with my work and my ethos, my approach to doing research, my way of writing, etc. There's also a section that's really helpful that is all about sort of information for the authors to include. And that is the section where, so if you read here, read the instructions for authors. This will have more specific guidelines in terms of all the logistical things. So earlier I talked about, word count, what's the style guide. This is also something really good to preview, just to have a sense of what are the requirements for its submission. There's also information here about the peer review process. So once again here, information about word count, organization of the manuscript, and the types of writing products that they publish, along with style information, formatting, etc. All right. So that was basically what I went over a moment ago. This is just a screenshot of, again, the logistical things that you can consider as you're searching for a home. So here I'm just capturing a couple of the journals that were good candidates for me. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but again, just showing you how I organized the research and the types of things that I included as part of my research. Here are a couple more screenshots of other journals that I considered that I ended up eliminating as possible homes, along with the specific reasons. So for example, with the Journal of Youth and Adolescents, I learned that this journal tends to publish more quantitative papers, and our research was definitely more qualitative in its approach. So even though the title of a focus on youth and adolescents really matched our project, which is on sort of a Generation Z population, the methodologic approach didn't really align. So that was not a good candidate. Social media and society was another candidate for us, but we learned that there was a pretty hefty cost associated with publishing in this space. And also just from personal experience, it seems a little bit more challenging for our particular project. So this was also eliminated. Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy. We weren't sure if the direction of literacies was the way we wanted to go. We decided that our focus was more on identity, specifically generational identity, and less of literacy. So even though we could have made our manuscript work, we decided that this was not the audience or the home that we wanted to situate our work in. And similarly, we eliminated yet another journal because we weren't sure about the audience. So this Journal of Computer Mediated Communication, even though it spoke to kind of our space of TikTok as an area of communication, we were not really interested in gearing our work towards computer science as a field. So that was a reason for eliminating this. So when it came to the actual writing, we found it really helpful in our manuscript development to begin in the middle, which is basically the findings. So as you saw from this earlier screenshot, we devoted a lot of time to drafting and redrafting the findings section, because really that is the part that tells the heart of our story. And we went through this drafting phase iteratively, and we played to our strengths. So I, as the first author, did my role in sort of laying out the themes based on my data analysis, and my co-author, who has a whole lot more experience in manuscript writing, was able to pick apart some of the larger themes and identifying the sub-themes that go under that. So she was able to take all of my kind of linear points and create more of a hierarchical map, which allowed us to better see the story we were going to tell. And so the findings, I find, is a really hard part to write, but it's the most important, and it's often the part where you want to recompose in order to figure out what is the overall narrative, what is the significance, what is the contribution that you want to make, knowing that it's impossible to write about or incorporate all of the data, but the idea is to be able to tell a story that feels cohesive. So this is just giving you a glimpse again of how we went from that linear sort of outline of all kinds of key ideas to coming up with themes and sub-themes. So one of our themes, just for kicks, was about the process of self-definition for Generation Z on TikTok. And we were able to come up with sort of these anchoring points of introduction, how we are defining self-definition externally, self-definition internally. And so these were some of the ideas that came from organizing and reorganizing the data. So what I've been pointing out at this point is just this process that's very iterative and ongoing. And I found this quote from Dr. Menza to really resonate with my own process. Of course, everyone writes differently, but I think when it comes to manuscript writing, it is very common for writers to adopt a model in which they begin in the middle, which is the findings, and to work on sections simultaneously, often moving from one section to another section as a way to build coherence, flow, and connectedness. So that basically comprises the early writing phase. So the submission phase is a continuation of the early writing phase. You can think of it more as the late writing phase as you are gearing towards submitting the manuscript. So a question that I had when preparing this manuscript was, when is our manuscript ready for submission? And I found that my co-author, who was also my mentor through this process, she gave me some really helpful pointers. So I am kind of sharing them with you here. The advice that she gave me was to aim for 75 to 80% or good enough. And this came to me by surprise initially. I thought that, I wanted to submit my manuscript when I felt fully ready, when it felt good enough to send off and to be shared out into the world. And she told me that when you do that, you often become super attached to your writing, that it can be soul crushing when you don't get the outcome you want. Whether that is a decline or eyes and resubmit with extensive revisions. So she told me, aim for good enough or a grade of B. And that way it's like you have something that is good enough, you send it out there, and if it resonates with the editors, then you can go back and tweak it and incorporate feedback. So I think aiming for 75 to 80% works really well. If you know and sort of expect a revision, which is almost inevitable. So in some ways, this saves you a lot of time and a lot of heartache. So I wanted to start with this kind of personal wisdom shared by my co-author. Something else that she recommended is to pause and assess your manuscript in terms of considering the different weights. So I'll talk about this right. So when you are writing manuscript, balance becomes really important. You want to have a sense of how proportional the different sections are. So what that means is if you have a paper that is heavily weighted in the introduction, like for example, you have 2,000 words in your intro, but only 1,000 words in your findings, then that balance is not great for at least journal publications, because the idea with journal publications is often to ground your work in sort of data, whether it's empirical data or sort of conceptual ideas. So an introduction that's heavily weighted would need to be rewritten so it's more streamlined, and you want to make sure there's a lot more substance in the form of perhaps findings. So we were assessing and reassessing our manuscript to make sure that the weights felt balanced within our manuscript. So you can see here how an earlier manuscript in the purple had certain numbers of words, were then kind of reworked, all while maintaining an overall word count of less than 8,000, which was the limit for our. So something else that we thought about and that was really important in terms of assessing whether we were ready or not, again, related to this idea of weights, is to ensure that you have a manuscript that sort of follows the format of other articles of that same journal. And I found this strategy of write by numbers, which was introduced to me by Dr. John Margo, to be really powerful. So this is how he recommends going about creating a so-called journal article template to guide the writing of your own manuscript. So you identify a target journal, you find a text or an article within that journal that you feel like serves as a good companion text or a mentor text. You want to make sure that this article is fairly recent so that it is sort of most up to date. You read it, and then you annotate it using this strategy called Write by Numbers, which comes from this book. So after you find your mentor text, you take a PDF version of it and you export it into Microsoft Word. And then you use the word count feature to sort of count up the different sections, essentially asking the question, how much space is devoted to each of the sections? The intro, the methods, the findings, etc. So after you get those numbers, then you have a general framework for how much can go into each section. So this is what is meant by writing by numbers. You're writing by the amount of words allotted for each of the sections. And this helps you write in a way that is weighted appropriately for a journal. And using this template, you can then draft your manuscript. So this process, again, might not be one that you undergo when you're writing a course paper. So as I had said earlier, writing for publication is a very specific kind of writing with particular strategies. So this idea of writing by numbers is suited just for kind of more targeted journal writing. So you might now wonder, like, what are the general word counts for each of the sections? And this is a slide that's reproduced from Dr. John Wargo's presentation. These numbers obviously vary, but it gives you a pretty good framework for what to expect. So as you can see, the findings section is the most heavily weighted with the most number of words. Intro and conclusion tend to have similar word counts. Theoretical framework sometimes gets absorbed into sort of the lit review section, sometimes its own part. So this is just meant to be helpful, give you a sense. In terms of the numbers you see there, I think this is just another recommendation for the order in which to write things. So the methods section is fairly easy to write because it's fairly straightforward. Findings is often the next section that you write. It's sort of the core of your writing framework, and often the intro and the conclusion are written last. So something else that my co-author and I did to kind of assess the readiness of our manuscript is to focus on our findings and seeing whether the organization of our findings made sense. And by making sense, we basically use this framework. I'm not sure that's the language she used, but evaluating our finding section with this idea of 3 levels of data. This is something very specific that she taught me that may or may not be relevant for your writing, depending on your discipline and your field, but I thought I would share it nonetheless. So our findings section for this publication that we put out had 3 key themes, as you see here. And so I'm just picking one of the themes and showing you the 3 levels of data. So the 3 levels have to do with like how in depth you go into particular findings. So the way that we did it was we made sure that certain data that told a more powerful story, we gave it more attention. And so that was like highest level. So the first example that you see on top, we quoted extensively from this particular TikTok video. And so that was like level 1, so very much in depth. Level 2 data was when we took certain ideas, but they were probably not as involved and they didn't take up a whole lot more space in our writing. So in the second kind of box, you see some of these examples. So we had a couple more second level data, but like only a few level 1 because it took up so much more. And there's just so much richness that we want to devote lots of emphasis on one example. Level 3 data is kind of the most simple, straightforward. We did not give it a lot of attention in terms of amount of words or analysis. And so the third example that you see on the bottom, we saw examples of, for example, this theme of like traumatic events shaping generational identity formation. And we listed a bunch of different types of events that showed up in the data. So this listing was considered sort of a level 3 data. So we use these 3 levels of data to make our findings a little bit more dynamic and more organized. So it wasn't just big example followed by big example followed by big example, but there was more variety and dynamism. And this was something that my co-author, I think, learned from experience, from reading a lot of manuscript and seeing that there's a particular pattern to how journal article findings are organized. So that, of course, as part of manuscript preparation, you often will have images, figures, or tables. And in my case, it was really important that we de-identified our figures to protect identities of the people in our TikTok videos. So as part of manuscript preparation, assessing whether something is ready for submission is to make sure that your tables and figures are appropriately formatted and you're undergoing all the protections necessary. Literature is something you also want to evaluate to see whether it is up to date. So one of the final steps for us before we submitted our manuscript was to incorporate literature from the target journal. And as we tried to incorporate more of the more contemporary, more recent literature. So as you can see here, we ended up deciding on Journal of Youth Studies, and we specifically went into the journal to look for articles that seemed to be in conversation with ours, and we incorporated this into our manuscript towards the end. So that's about it for this video. I know there's a whole lot more that goes behind the scenes, that goes on behind the scenes in terms of manuscript preparation. Every manuscript can look different depending on the discipline, depending on your field, depending on the type of writing product. But I'm hoping that this serves as a beginning to give you a sense of what might happen so you are more informed. I hope this was helpful, and thank you for joining us.